Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's the last lecture of the day, and I'm very privileged to have been asked to speak to you all on a subject that is very, very close to my heart for many reasons, as I will explain. Inspired by marine forms, early English porcelain transforms the dining table. I mean, we have been riveted and heard and have been described and illustrated by Ivan Day earlier on some of the spectacular and rather ordinary dishes of food that were put before the court, and also the aristocracy in their country homes, but also before the individuals. But I'm going to show you some of the shapes that were used. But I will just say, and we begin here setting the scene. It's a London scene. It's the River Thames. On the right-hand side, which shamefully the artist was not able to paint, is the north side of the Thames. So we would have the Chelsea manufactory here, Church Lane East, and then on to Lawrence Street afterwards. But what you do see here on the south side is the reaches of Battersea and coming into... It would do, Tony, wouldn't it? Yes. But you can see one of the bottle kilns there, probably one of the very, very last of the westernmost pottery kilns. It was the closest I could find to a marine scape for you to begin. What I need to say, though, is there are two points that I want to clearly mention in this lecture. There are two. The silver taste or the silver style in porcelain is extremely important. It's important for a number of reasons, but the most important of all the points is that without silver, the porcelain manufacturers would not exist. In business terms, it was essential for them, their first stage and step before they were really able to improve their bodies, their pace, their glaze, they had to show the new and the novel material in the shapes and the forms of silver. Otherwise, those who were rich enough to buy the porcelain would not understand the shapes. And they needed to make it very clear to the aristocracy, the mercantile classes, and the royal family that porcelain was not quite as good as silver, but it could be used in the same shapes and forms. So defining the characteristics, I thought I'd list this for you. Pieces that are based on specific designs by silversmiths, B, produced at the factory and left as white porcelain because that white porcelain is finished, and moulding in relief where the ornament is the only decoration. Why did they need to adopt the silver style? To appeal to the aristocratic and money classes, to compete with the silver trade in terms of novelty, and fashionable forms were silver shapes. This is an English lecture, and I'm showing you Frenchmen. But Gabriel Herquier, painted here by Jean Perrenot, was one of the most important people to disseminate this style into English porcelain. He had an engraving studio on the Rue Perron in Paris, and it is a design that I choose to show you first, which is a design by Francois Boucher and signed down in the left-hand corner of two playful putty over an open clamshell supported by two dolphins. In some way, a play on words, perhaps, for Boucher, who was also going to be drawn into producing designs for the Vincennes and Sèvres manufactory in about 1749, Dolphin, Dauphin. But what we have here is a design by Boucher, engraved by Herquier, and published and made available in England and in London, crucially. What you can see on the right-hand side, as we've already seen, but a colour image in Catherine Jones's lecture earlier this morning, one of the pair of source boats that we've seen from Frederick, Prince of Wales's Neptune service, marked with the mark for Nicholas Fremont and delivered for Frederick, Prince of Wales in 1743. There are a total of 4 in the Royal Collection. And you can see, essentially, that the idea comes in inspiration from the original Boucher drawing engraved by Herquier. Nicholas Fremont, as we all know, not only designed and made silverware, but also with his 2 friends and business companions, Charles Guan, the great courtier jeweller, who based his work and his retail premises very close to us in St. James's on Bennett Street. But also, the other crucial person was Anthony Suppley. And it is thought that he was the chemist, the man who had the understanding of how to handle the elements that go into the production of porcelain. Fremont had the knowledge of the shapes and the forms. Guan knew what the aristocracy were after, so had that very, very focused idea of taste. And here, one of the very, very first of the items produced at Chelsea during the first period, the triangle period, those pieces that are marked sometimes with the incised triangle that symbolized the alchemical symbol of fire, having gone through the fire. And we can see a very, very rare example here of white porcelain of the silver taste left in the white and from the Museum of London. White porcelain also, and I do encourage you all to try this. Tony will be able to try this, I'm sure, because he has quite a lot of it. But white porcelain, glazed white porcelain, try it on your dinner table at night by candlelight and watch the play of light on it. It's white and dark. It's like looking at silver as well. And some of the manufactories in England, the Worcester manufactory particularly, in the Scratch Cross period, so about 1754, they intentionally blued their glaze. It gave it a grey characteristic. And that grey characteristic of the Scratch Cross body from the first period, Worcester, they're mostly all in the silver shapes, forms, and mouldings. And here, another piece of Chelsea porcelain. There are 2 of these that are recorded, one in a private collection in Toronto, the other in another private collection in England. This item has been decorated outside of the manufactory, and if I could ask you to look at the puce dotting here, which are washed over by green, to simulate seaweed. On the open upturn clam shell, which, as we have seen before, there you can see F. Boucher and Herquier, avec privilège du roi, there. So, design drawn by Boucher and engraved by Herquier, and simply inspiring the shape made at Chelsea here within the incised triangle period as well. Bow were at it already at this stage, in 1747, courtesy of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and particularly Tom Mickey, who I know is here today. Thank you very much for allowing me to use this. Here you see a slightly more stylized version, and it has lost its elegance and natural poise that the original Boucher design has, because we have a very, very angry-looking fish here that looks like it has already eaten the putto that should have been on top. And a very rare a chance to have a look at the backside of the fish, where there are stamped and applied leaves and flowers, and I assure you, painted in those wonderful, absolutely typical colours of bow from the Alderman Arnold period, from the late 1740s, aubergines, greens, sort of russety oranges and claret colours. And this example here, the only other example that I know of, at any rate, which is in the Geoffrey Freeman collection at Pallant House. Just Aurel Meissonier, the other Frenchman that I'm going to tell you about today, as I'm sure every one of you knows in this room, I've put his dates there for you, but also to show that he was Orfèvre du Roi for Louis XV. It is my job to introduce him to you, and also for you to see his design for featuring the design for the Kingston tureens with the surtout de table at the central feature of this. But I want to show you this because Meissonier becomes quite important for, again, seeding the inspiration of some of the porcelain shapes that I am about to show you. Here is one of the Kingston tureens, made for the second Duke of Kingston to a design by Meissonier in 1734 by the two Paris silversmiths that I've listed there. This example is in the Cleveland Museum of Art. This shows a vision of fantastical Rococo design. It's almost as if you have put your arm into a great rock pool with the swirls of water to see the cast ornament of the lobster or crayfish at the top, together with these extraordinary cast leaves, seaweeds, and stylized extended shell motifs along with radishes as well there. So a triumph of Rococo from the designed by Meissonier. But the reason I brought him in is because that the a plate that I've shown here from the Livre des Légumes, the designs, the work of Juste Aurel Meissonier, which was published in Paris in 1744, is clearly seen by Nicholas Fremont and his designers. And he had already created in 1743 the extraordinary crayfish salts in the silver gilt ones that we were looking at this morning. And you can see here, perhaps inspired by that particular plate. Incised triangle body here, a very stylized shell, almost looking a little foliate in its design there. But one doesn't get the chance to often look at these very closely, and it is extraordinary the way that they were made. A moulded and part sculpted rockwork base applied with shells, some of which have been moulded from, they tend to be, with Chelsea, they tend to be English estuary shells. At Bow, we sometimes see rather tropical shells. For example, the Strombus gigas from the Caribbean. But here we can see whelks, limpets, and cockles that have been put here. There's a very fine limpet for you to see, and on the side of which there are sometimes the nautilus or turret shells. But I want to show you this piece that was owned by a very, very great friend of mine and a singular person who I owe a great amount of my mentoring, the late Harry Hyams. And this was one of his early pieces and most important pieces of incised triangle body Chelsea, which shows a pagod, as Brian said in his verse, and teetering over a clutch of rocks with draped fish here, looking rather like the plate on the left, on the one side, and Neptune's shells here, a frogged whelk, I think that one is, and the seaweed is created by sieved clay, so pushing through little buttons of clay through a sieve, you create these rather effective pieces of weed. And here is a plate engraved after Meissonier's designs for a series of shell-like vessels or objects. And I want you to look carefully at this one here and this one here. These are very stylized, I must admit, with some excellent thoughts of coral, weed and smaller shells, but they become more natural when we see them in England. And on the right-hand side here, another piece of bow, a triple shell salt or spice shell, and you can see here applied with stipple clay, English shells on this case, in this very early bow example, and an application of some coral here. The shell on the left, an upturned nautilus shell, becomes an open clam. We can't say they're scallop shells because those would be flat, but you can see the design on the base of this one, of this very stylized shell, designed by Meissonier, has been extended to form an accretion that the shell can be supported on. This is from Dr. McKenna's collection, and this in Pallant House. That shell can be propelled and extrapolated in many different spheres here. There is a Spreemont, attributed to Spreemont, 1745, and heavily cast. I've held it in my hand. It's very heavy. One of the Meissonier prints that we've seen, the engravings that we've seen, has a serpent coming out of, or an eel coming out of the bulrushes. Well, there it is, there. Vauxhall porcelain from the mid-1750s, a stylized shell, and perhaps having some inspiration from that plate of essentially upturned shells. The Chelsea Triangle period here. Brian and I had this shell a number of years ago. It had been masquerading as a piece of bow porcelain, but through transmitted light and studying it intensely, we realized that it was an unrecorded example from the incised triangle period at Chelsea. Its handle now evoked rather dramatically as a writhing tentacle from an octopus thrown out to one side. Derby porcelain again shows that a very stylized shell. But at Derby, as well as Bow, you do get these rather more exotic shells that are used, particularly cowries, for example. I think probably the shape that is most similar to that example of the triple shell support that we've seen in the Meissonier engraved shell designs that I showed you. For the shells are very stylized here, and the stromboid shell on the Meissonier design is rather interestingly similarly evoked here. Another bow piece on the right-hand side, dating from the early 1750s, and Vauxhall again, clearly influenced by that central triple shell salt or sweetmeat stand, as the early bow example in the V&A on the right, this time with the inclusion of whelk egg ropes here, draped across the shells. Plymouth, 1768, characteristic smokiness to the kilns there, which they could never really get rid of that smokiness, so it always has an orange or browny look to it. And then Worcester, 1765. Dr. Wall, who was my great-grandfather, was able to persuade John Toulouse to come up from Bow and brought the knowledge of putting these shells and corals together. Also, interestingly, provided the knowledge of how to make flowers and some figures, although those were not a great success at Worcester. Worcester adds, but probably now being affected by other porcelain that they've seen, rather than the engravings that we've seen, add a triumphal dolphin as a central feature. Individual items here from the Pallant House collection, which were to adorn the table as well. There's the plate again, and here are the upturn shells that I think certainly are evoked for inspiration from that single piece there. Although at Lunds Bristol, which is where we first see that shape, there are about 3 of these recorded, 2 large, 1 small. This is the smaller one from Bernard Watney's collection. And so we see that circa 1749, just before Lund's, poor old Benjamin Lund had to, and Mr. Miller, who, having pulled his money and financial support, laid the path clear for Dr. Wall and his 14 other partners to buy the Lunds Bristol as a going concern. There we have a very, very rare example of a Worcester porcelain triple shell sweetmeat stand, clearly inspired by this and left in the white to equate the silver form. The shell comes back in use in the late 1750s. We even see it again in the late 1760s, where it can have quite an incongruous gross blur border and a panel of European flowers. At Liverpool, Samuel Gilbody's manufactory. The model was also found at William Reed's manufactory as well. The 2 bodies slightly different, the Reed showing a greyness to the body itself, but the Samuel Gilbody piece here, wonderfully bright white with a little iridescence in the glaze. If anyone wants to come and see it, it's in the gallery. It is sold, so we have no axe to grind there. And the Plymouth example of a triple shell salt, taking some inspiration as well, perhaps, from the dolphin supports that you see here. And what I wanted to do was to put the Plymouth next to the Bristol. So as we know, that manufactory moved to Bristol, where it was able to further purify and better its paste and glaze. So we see the orangey brown on the left of Plymouth, where they had problems, as I told you, in the kiln. But at Bristol, everything's better. It's clear and it's white again. Worcester here, single shells that again are these upturned clams, and seated on these extraordinary shell accretions, which I think probably are the nearest you get to the evocation of the sort of perfect shell. And on the right, as we say, everyone was doing it, but there were these very, very rare Vauxhall porcelain shells, which came up in one of Fergus's sales, I think, where they were catalogued as very rare Vauxhall. Derby, not to be outdone, on these great Strombus gigas shells here, But this is actually a punch bowl. The shell is enormous. And on the right-hand side, we see a bow example. But if you remember the silver-gilt cream boat that I showed you that was attributed to Nicholas Fremont, you will remember the embossed work on the alternate gadroons. Well, here you see it here, but it's painted. And what I would say to you all is look at your blue and white porcelains with a different eye, because in order to further the trompe-l'oeil effect of a silver shape and form, the borders should be looked at as possibly simulating embossed work or chasing, and I will show you some simulated engraving work in a few moments. But think of that as a type of evocation of the silver design. Another bow example here with the very, very rare feature of the soft shell English crab there clambering over coral. Chelsea Triangle period porcelain from the Enlightenment galleries in the British Museum, and a very, very stylized version of this, which is a Meissonier design engraved by Herquier there in about 1740. And I should say again, thank you to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston for being able to show that. I believe the only example of a white silver taste salt from Chelsea's incised triangle period. On the top left, we have a cast example of a silver scallop by the Huguenot Peter R. Cambo, dated in London, 1738. And you can actually, it's bleached out because it's so white behind. That was the reverse of the Limehouse shell here. What I think, though, with these is that, very interestingly, you sometimes and very rarely get little fruit painted in the corners. I'd love to know whether that was in somehow a direction of what should be put in the centre of these things, if it was a pickle of some sort. I'm told that sometimes people ate oysters out of these. I'm not sure. I'm not a silver specialist. But you do get the shape coming through all manner of the early factories in England. And we have three of the earliest here. An extremely rare Lunds Bristol one that comes from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has underglazed manganese. There are only two examples of that recorded. One is a sort of dragon pattern that happens to be in a private collection, and this. But there is a figure of Lu Tung Pin, which has a manganese, sort of smoky manganese base, and I suppose you could count that as the third. One of the more interesting comparisons here is the great Vincent Chalepin, or centrepiece, circa 1745 to 50, which was in the Rosebery collection at Mentmore Towers. And you can see every piece of this drilled, tined through, and put on the gilded ormolu central stand over the salver here, the porcelain salver. And this, which belongs to somebody here, thank you very much, Jonathan, for allowing me to use it, a Limehouse shell, found with 5 others at the time, and all sewn through with a piece of twine. It was found at Belton House in the kitchens at the time of the sale in 1983. The house of the Brownlows, the Earls Brownlow, and they'd inherited Belton in 1721. But I've looked at this and examined it very carefully with the owner, and the whole is actually glazed through as well. And so I'd like you to imagine something like this for Limehouse, which shows really the great lengths that even Limehouse was going to show the top fashionable shapes of the period. Again, an extremely rare shape. One of the most ambitious of the shell centerpieces. It should have a little upturned clamshell here, but each of the 6 stylized clamshell cups are mounted on top of a long turret shell, like a sort of medieval damsel's hat underneath, so that you can take these out, and they were referred to as oyster cup stands. Some of the largest of the shell accretions. I should say also that in England particularly there was an enormous interest in shells, and of course the Enlightenment has to be mentioned here, because with the exploration, yearnings of science and knowledge at the time, and the amount of exploration that was going on, with ships returning with great sort of ballasts of shells, and naturalists going with them to bring back some really very exotic items. Shells were very important, and they were important for Sir Hans Sloane, for example, that wonderful 17th and 18th century courtier who straddled that period from 1660 to 1753. And of course, the nucleus of his shell collection was actually bought from William Dampier, the first Englishman to set foot on Australia or New Holland in the 1680s. And of course, those shells form the basis, the nucleus of the Sloane collection, and therefore the British Museum, which was founded in 1759. A Derby example on the left, and from 1760, and also another very large example of perhaps a sweetmeat stand, a shell centerpiece at any rate, or an oyster stand surmounted by an eagle. One of the great shapes, which I couldn't resist showing you, was probably the largest piece of first period Worcester that was ever made. It is vast, whereabouts unknown at the moment, in case any of you might be able to tell me, but based on a form clearly looking at some of the most fashionable silver work of the time, that of Paul de Lamery. But I've included it in this lecture because these are mythical mermen or mer creatures, so it rather nicely fitted into that. Another reason why Dr. Wall, the entrepreneur up at Worcester, here shows smoky primitives for the very first time, decorating these silver shapes, but he developed the smoky primitives, which went on to become engraving under the Holdship brothers and Robert Hancock. I feel he's trying to further the trompe-l'oeil silver taste, because this is very much like engraving on silver. Naturalism comes in the 1750s, and it comes in a very, very grand way. Chelsea Manufactory has succeeded in the time that we have been dealing with other factories. We go back to Chelsea and find that they have developed their paste and their glaze, and they are able to produce some very, very ambitious forms, natural forms again. And here we have one of the most natural forms. Circa 1754-55, they appear in the 55 and 56 catalogues. But you have a jumping place here. The top part forming the cover. And a wonderful little eel here, which has gripped the end of a cockle shell, which is the ladle itself. And I thought it was very interesting looking at the bills of fare that Ivan Day was showing us earlier on. Anchovy and shrimp sauce, collard eel, fried soles. These are all things that we should read. When we're reading those, we should imagine the porcelain shapes and look and see how these were served. I mean, were the fried soles put on here? I mean, we're used to looking at this standing on that, but was that the case? I don't know. I'd like to. A Chelsea carp here from the fourth day's sale on March the 13th, lot 12, 2 fine large carps and 2 dishes. Well, again, we've seen the fish laid out on the charger in one of Ivan's rather wonderful slides. But naturalism here now being the key element, and of course they were producing lots of fruit shapes and vegetable forms. Chelsea was very much the greatest sort of fertile area of London. It still is an alluvial floodplain. The soil was very fertile. This is where they grew the food to feed London, where the market gardens were, the nurseries for trees, nurseries for fruit, the orchards, that's where they were. And there was the river, life coming from the river. So it was for them a natural Rococo, man's triumph over nature. Nothing so stylized, nothing that was taken into pure fantasy as the taste was on the continent in a different way. But here in England, we chose to rather keep that to a natural and more scientific approach. And here, one of the Chelsea eel tureens, sold in pairs in the 1755 sale, undercoloured here in a lighter colour, showing it's a mature eel. They were called silver bellies. And this was at the mature stage, which was coming down the River Thames at that point and going off to spawn in the Sargasso Sea. So they were catching them at their largest. And finally, something again, from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, something that shows mackerel here on probably at the end of the raised anchor period with that type of scalloped shell shape there, and a sort of fatty look that it has to show that it's probably got a bit of tin glaze in there still. And if you were to put it up the light, you would see moons, those air bubbles that are inside the body. But I think nothing could crown the production at Chelsea in a more natural way than seeing the fish here, seeing the fennel here, and seeing one of Ivan's 240 types of gooseberry there. And, oh, there's 2, you're right. 2, there we go.
They were used for mackerel sauce. French name is Porcelain.
Aha, how wonderful, how wonderful. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave you. Thank you.